It was supposed to be like any other midnight mass. Candles flickered against stained glass, casting trembling colors across the cold stone walls. The choir's voices rose in reverence as incense drifted through the air, thick and sacred. At the center of it all stood Bishop Adrian Keller, a figure beloved by his congregation, respected far beyond his parish. But what happened that night shattered not only the silence, but reality itself. In the middle of his homily, just as he raised his hands in blessing, the bishop simply vanished. There was no sound, no scream, no rush of air. One blink, he was there. The next, only empty space beneath the altar's towering crucifix. Panic erupted. Some thought it was an attack. Others whispered of divine intervention. The choir fell silent mid him. Parishioners scrambled through the pews, searching behind the altar, through the vestry, into the candlelit corridors, but the bishop was gone. Completely. As if he had been plucked from existence itself. The Mass never finished that night. And for over 2 decades, neither did the questions. Searches followed. Investigations. Every corner of the cathedral was scoured. The underground tunnels, the bell tower, even the sealed crypt beneath the sacristy. Nothing. No footprints. No struggle. No trace. His vestments remained folded neatly in the sacristy. But his ring, the bishop's gold signet, a sacred symbol of his office, was gone with him. It was as if whatever took him knew exactly what it needed and what it meant. And slowly, over the years, his story faded from headlines, whispered instead between trembling lips and midnight prayers. Until the morning, 22 years later, when a gardener restoring the overgrown courtyard unearthed something. Buried beneath the roots of an ancient olive tree was the bishop's ring, untarnished, untouched by time. But what sent chills through those who saw it was what lay beneath the ring. A scrap of parchment, impossibly preserved, bearing a single line written in Latin, "I never left." How the parchment survived decades underground, untouched by moisture or decay, remains as unexplained as the bishop's disappearance itself. And suddenly, the questions no one dared to ask out loud returned, sharper, louder, heavier. What really happened in that midnight mass? Where did the bishop go? Why was his ring buried? Not in a vault, but in the earth beneath the very place where he vanished. And most unsettling of all, what did he mean by "I never left"? Today, we step beyond the veil of what we think we know into one of the most mysterious disappearances ever recorded inside sacred walls. A story that does not ask for belief, only that you listen. The day after Bishop Adrian Keller vanished, the cathedral's grand doors remained shut, mournful and foreboding. News of his disappearance spread like wildfire through the city streets, carried by hushed conversations and trembling breaths. Reporters flocked, priests prayed in corners, and the cathedral's corridors lay empty except for flickering candlelight. But everywhere you looked, on cracked stone floors or in polished wood pews, one question echoed louder than all others. How could someone vanish during Mass, under the most sacred ritual of blessing? Despite his sudden absence, the Mass was almost surreal in its pause, as if the entire cathedral itself held its breath. Choirmen abandoned their lyrics mid-note. Acolytes froze, candles still clenched in hand. Parishioners did not weep aloud. Their shock was too deep, too visceral. Some covered their mouths. Others fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in horror. The central crucifix, bathed in candlelight, seemed to tremble with unanswered questions. It was precisely this tension, the felt emptiness, that transformed a moment of worship into an echo that still reverberates. Once police and church officials arrived, the investigation that followed was exhaustive. The cathedral's labyrinthine cloisters were combed, confessionals searched, and the bell tower examined by drones. But there was no evidence of a struggle, no sign that he had tried to escape, no weapon, door forced open, nothing but the echo of unanswered prayers. It felt as though someone had ripped a page out of reality during the most sacred moment. Blessing, congregation, ritual, and the cathedral had no way to cope. As the months turned to years, the barren expanse beneath the altar became a symbol, an absence more profound than any stain or scar. The bishop's vestments remained folded, untouched, as if waiting. His chair sat empty during every ceremony thereafter. Below it, An unseen gravity held everything still. The faithful returned, but they never fully regained their certainty. Every candle burned with an awareness that something already gone might still linger. Little remained but whispers, whispered memories of Bishop Keller's warm hands, his quiet encouragement, his belief in compassion over doctrine. One recurring detail emerged. During that particular Mass, his sermon had been unusually intimate, almost confessional. He had paused by name, thanking the congregation, invoking protection, but in that moment of open heart he simply vanished. In the first year after his disappearance, rumors proliferated, from suspicious cult activity to supernatural abductions. But nothing stuck, and no credible evidence emerged. Still, families of the bishop claimed something was amiss. The bishop had spoken of uncovering a betrayal in the clergy, of rediscovering a secret foundation beneath the courtyard. He'd made veiled references to burying the past once, perhaps forever. Some dismissed it as a tired man's musings. But as whispers spread, the courtyard grew eerily still, grass flattened in strange patterns, birds avoiding the olive tree, and footsteps echoing even when the plantings were untouched. A decade later, a group of archaeologists was granted entry to investigate beneath the courtyard, hoping to discover underground drains or forgotten Franciscan burial chambers. They dug gently, layer by layer, until the earth yielded something unexpected. The gleaming gold ring once worn by Bishop Keller. Inserted gently into its burial, it remained as though placed with intention and care. But what truly unsettled them was what lay with it. A parchment, crisp and unweathered, bearing the Latin words, Numquam reliqui, I never left. The ring itself was intact. Centuries of fresh water, soil acidity, nothing corroded its surface. It was the bishop's ring, the family crest, saintly iconography, and an inscription within the band that matched exactly the one he wore that night. But the real miracle lay in the parchment, preserved in soil at least 4 feet deep, an impossible artifact that contradicted every known law of decay. The words suggested not death, disappearance, or flight, but presence. He had always been there. Historians turned to the scriptures, interpreting the Latin message as his final sermon, not delivered in voice, but in deed. Was this the secret he'd discovered beneath the courtyard? A revelation, a confession of seeing something no one else could? The phrase echoed like a benediction, a promise, a haunting gospel of his continued presence. Soon, theologians, reporters, and pilgrims converged again on the cathedral. Some came for answers. Others came with trembling hope, longing for a miracle sight like Lourdes. But the courtyard remained quiet, its grass undisturbed, its olive tree looming overhead, its secrets buried once again, or perhaps never exhumed. And in that stillness, the echo of I never left settled into something larger than a letter. It became a question invited into the heart. The days following the discovery of the bishop's ring were filled with a tension that could be felt in the bones of anyone who stepped near the cathedral. It wasn't the tension of fear, it was something more subtle, more unsettling. A pull, as if the ground itself remembered something the people had long forgotten. Crowds gathered, but unlike the chaos that had filled the square 22 years earlier, now there was only reverent silence. Faces turned toward the olive tree, toward the courtyard where the earth had surrendered its secret. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone felt the same question hanging in the air. Had he truly never left? Among those who came was Father Matteo, a priest who had served under Bishop Keller in his final years. He hadn't stepped foot in that courtyard since the night of the disappearance. When he approached the spot where the ring was found, his knees buckled, not from age but from memory. He whispered, barely audible, I remember, the day before he vanished. He said, there are things beneath this cathedral that were never meant to be forgotten. No one had taken him seriously then. But now, those words came back like a tide, drowning everything they thought they knew. What began as whispers soon turned into private investigations, sleepless nights filled with ancient records and forgotten maps of the cathedral's foundation. And there it was, a line in an 18th century ledger referencing the sealed chamber beneath the bishop's courtyard. But no such chamber appeared on any modern blueprint. If it ever existed, it had been erased, not by time but by intention. Suddenly, the message on the parchment wasn't just poetic. It was literal. The bishop hadn't left because he was still there. Engineers were brought in, ground-penetrating radar sweeping the soil. What they found was beyond anything expected. A hollow space, perfectly square, exactly beneath the olive tree. But stranger still, the radar picked up something else. Movement. Not mechanical. Not wildlife. Something rhythmic. Something pulsing, like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. Technicians dismissed it as equipment error. But those who stood there listening felt it. Not imagined. Not theoretical. A vibration beneath their feet. Subtle, but undeniable. It was no longer just a mystery. It had become a haunting realization. The bishop's message wasn't symbolic. It was a declaration. And with that realization came a flood of even darker questions. Was the ring left as a clue? A key? A warning? And if the bishop never left, what exactly had he become? As word spread, the Vatican intervened quietly, not to silence the discovery, but to contain it. Teams arrived under the guise of restoration experts. Fences went up. Excavations were ordered under strict confidentiality. But those living closest to the cathedral noticed things the officials couldn't hide. Lights in the chapel at night, when no one was scheduled to be inside. Shadows moving behind stained glass, not in random patterns, but in rhythmic pulses, like someone walking in perfect circles. Or praying. Then came the dreams. First among the workers. Then among the residents living near the cathedral. Men and women woke in the dead of night, drenched in cold sweat, whispering the same sentence without knowing why. The Mass is not over. Reports piled up of people hearing organ music in the early hours. But the cathedral had no functioning organ since a lightning strike damaged it years before. Parents reported their children waking up crying, saying, "The man in white is calling from the floor." Inside the sealed chamber beneath the olive tree, workers uncovered something that froze every breath in the room. A stone door. Perfectly preserved. No hinges. No handle. Only a symbol carved into its surface. The bishop's signet. Identical to the ring that had been found. It wasn't a decorative carving. It was an imprint, as though the ring itself was meant to fit into it. A key. A seal. A message written in stone. One priest who was present later admitted, when they placed the ring into the imprint, the door didn't open. The earth around us did. A vibration, low but deafening, rumbled through the courtyard. Dust fell from the cathedral walls. The olive tree's roots trembled. And then, silence, a silence so suffocating it felt physical, like standing inside a vacuum. Everyone stood frozen, waiting, but for what, no one knew. And then from beneath their feet, clear, soft, impossible, came the echo of a voice. Not loud, not shouting, just speaking, gentle, familiar. A voice they hadn't heard in 22 years. The Mass is not over. Every candle in the cathedral relit itself. No one moved. No one breathed. Those words, "The Mass is not over," carried a weight that shattered logic, fractured reason, and flooded every soul present with a mix of dread and awe. The vibration that had rumbled through the courtyard softened, but did not disappear. It settled into something else, a pulse. A living presence that seemed to hum beneath the soles of their feet, as though the earth itself had become a vessel for something unspeakably sacred. For a moment, the air smelled of incense. Not the faint echo of ceremonies long gone, but fresh, recent, as though the Mass had continued underground all these years, uninterrupted, unseen. The air inside the courtyard grew heavier, thicker, but not suffocating. It was as if the space itself had shifted into a kind of consecrated tension. The line between sacred and impossible was now paper-thin. One of the engineers, a skeptic, a man of science, stepped forward, drawn not by duty, but by something deeper. He pressed his hand against the stone door. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even stone. It felt warm, soft beneath his fingertips, like the pulse of skin just beneath the surface. He jerked his hand back, trembling, whispering to no one in particular. "It's breathing." No one laughed. No one doubted, because they had felt it too. The lead investigator, a Vatican envoy named Father Lucian, turned pale. In his hands, he still held the bishop's ring, now glowing faintly under the gray sky. Not with fire, not with light, with life. He realized then that this wasn't just an artifact. It wasn't just a key. It was a covenant, a living connection between what was above and what had been sealed below. His hands trembled as he stepped toward the door, knowing that what lay behind it was never meant to be forgotten, or perhaps even found. He fitted the ring into the carved imprint, not like a lock, not like a mechanism, but like returning something to where it had always belonged. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the vibration intensified. The olive tree's branches trembled. The stained glass windows rattled without wind. A deep, resonant chime rang out, not from the bells, but from beneath, as if the earth itself had become an instrument, a prelude, a signal. The stone didn't open like a door. It dissolved, silently, grain by grain, into dust, as if time itself was releasing something it had been forced to hold too long. What lay beyond wasn't a tomb, wasn't a crypt, wasn't what anyone had prepared for. It was a chamber, circular, walls lined with ancient symbols, none that matched any known language, yet instantly felt understood. Shapes that vibrated at the edge of vision, glyphs that looked less like writing and more like echoes frozen into form. At the center was an altar, but not one for sacrifice, not one for offering. It was shaped like a baptismal font, but wider, deeper, bottomless. Its surface wasn't stone. It wasn't water. It was reflection. A mirror, yes, but not one that reflected the face. It reflected something else, something beneath the surface of the self. Those who dared glance into it didn't see their image. They saw memories they hadn't recalled in years, regrets they thought had died, prayers they'd forgotten they ever whispered. And then, surrounding the font, 12 pillars, each one marked with the sign of a bishop's ring. 12. One missing. The 13th stood empty, and on the floor in front of it, a robe, folded neatly. The bishop's robe, untouched by time, pristine, laid with the same precision as the vestments that had been left behind in the sacristy all those years ago. But the most impossible discovery wasn't the robe. It was what lay at the base of the 13th pillar. A footprint, fresh, pressed into the dust, as if someone had just stepped away, moments before the door dissolved. It faced outward, not into the chamber, out of it, as though whoever stood there wasn't waiting to be found. They had already walked through, already left, already moved into somewhere else. And then the voice returned, not from the chamber, not from the walls, from everywhere, from the air, from within. I never left. I never left. I never left. 3 times. A benediction, or a warning. The echo of those words, I never left, didn't fade like sound. It lingered, wrapped around every corner of the chamber, sinking into skin, breath, and bone. No one dared speak. Some wept. Others clutched their chests as though steadying themselves against something not seen but felt. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something heavier, the overwhelming sense that they were standing not in front of mystery, but inside one, a living one that was still unfolding. Father Lucien, who had led the excavation, tried to steady his voice but found it shaking. We are not meant to be here. His words were barely a whisper. Yet even as he said them, something inside him argued the opposite. Maybe they were always meant to be here. Maybe this chamber hadn't been sealed to keep something locked away, but to protect what was above from understanding something too sacred, too vast, too irreversible. The reflection in the font shifted. No one touched it. No breeze disturbed it. And yet, it moved, ripples without cause, until the surface stilled into a perfect, unnatural clarity. Each person saw something different. One technician saw his late mother, standing at the foot of his childhood bed, singing a lullaby. A priest saw the face of a man he'd excommunicated 30 years ago, not angry, but forgiving. A woman from the archaeology team collapsed to her knees, sobbing. When asked later what she saw, she only said, "It was but the version of me I was supposed to become, the one I didn't become." And then came the most impossible detail of all. Inside the mirror-like surface of the font, a shape appeared, faint at first, then undeniable. A hand, reaching, not from beneath, not from above, but from within, palm open, fingers outstretched. as though whoever, or whatever, had left the robe and the footprint hadn't truly left at all. The olive tree above groaned as a deep vibration pulsed through its roots, through the soil, into the floor of the chamber. Dust trembled from the pillars. And then, once again, the voice. Closer now. No longer distant. No longer disembodied. The Mass is not over. But this time, the words were not an echo. They were an invitation. What followed was not panic. Not chaos. It was surrender. As though everyone present understood, not with the mind, but with the marrow, that they were now participants in something beyond comprehension. Something liturgical, yes, but older than any liturgy. A ritual not written in books, but in silence, presence, and surrender. Father Lucien stepped forward, hand trembling as he reached toward the hand beneath the surface of the font. He never touched it, because as his fingers drew near, the reflection didn't break. It expanded. The font grew deeper, impossibly deep. The surface stretched outward, filling the chamber with a cold, weightless glow. The pillars illuminated as if filled with light from within. Symbols on the walls shifted, changing shape, forming, if only for a breath, something readable. Not in words, not in language, but in understanding. Every person present felt it at once. A memory that was not theirs, and yet belonged to them. A memory of being called, not to priesthood, not to service, to presence, to witness, to belonging in a way that transcended flesh, name, time. One worker whispered through trembling lips, "We were never meant to be alone." Another added, "This is what prayer sounds like from the other side." And then, as quickly as it began, the reflection in the font collapsed inward, not vanishing, but folding, like the closing of an eye, like the drawing of a breath before speech. The light faded, the pulse softened, the chamber remained, the robe, the footprint, the pillars. But the mirror was gone. Only still, cold stone remained. Yet in the hearts of those who stood there, something else remained too. A certainty, a knowing, that the bishop had not vanished. He had not escaped. He had crossed into something most of us will never see until the final breath, and maybe not even then. And somehow, impossibly, he was still leading the Mass. No one spoke for a long time. Each person stood frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer weight of what had just happened. It was as though language itself had become useless here. Whatever this was, whatever force or presence filled this sacred hollow, it operated beyond the limitations of words. The robe remained folded, the footprint sharp and fresh in the dust. And the pillars, 12 in a circle with one always meant to be empty, now felt less like architecture and more like participants. Father Lucien finally broke the silence, his voice trembling but reverent. "We came looking for him," he whispered, barely audible. But maybe it was never about finding him. Maybe it was about remembering who we are when we stop pretending we're separate from the sacred. His words didn't echo. They simply hung in the air, absorbed into the stone like a final page in a book no one had ever written, because it had always existed. And then the sound returned. Not a voice this time. Not words. A vibration. A deep, resonant hum that didn't move through the air, but through their bodies. It wasn't noise. It was order. As if the space itself, the earth, the roots, the stone, the forgotten breath of centuries, was remembering how to be. Some dropped to their knees without thinking. Others wept openly, but not from grief. It was release. It was the soft unraveling of everything they had carried for too long. In that moment, something became painfully clear to every person in that chamber. The bishop hadn't been taken. He hadn't disappeared. He had become part of the space itself. Or perhaps the space had become part of him. The words, "I never left," no longer felt like a haunting. They felt like truth. Not a presence trapped beneath the ground, but one woven into it. The vibration softened, the light dimmed. But in the final moments before the silence returned, the reflection shimmered once more on the smooth stone of the font. Just enough for them to see one final image, not of the bishop alone, but of the midnight Mass. Candles lit, choir robes swaying, parishioners with heads bowed, a Mass still unfolding, a Mass that, somehow, had never truly ended. When the doors to the chamber finally closed, not by force, but by their own will, as though the earth itself was folding back over the veil. The group emerged changed. They didn't speak much. Some held their hands over their hearts, as though trying to cradle the last echoes of what they'd felt. Others touched the olive tree gently, reverently, as if it now held part of them, or part of someone else. The Vatican classified the event immediately. Officially, the site was declared unstable, closed to the public under the guise of preservation efforts. But those who were there, they carried the truth in their skin, in their breath, in the silent spaces between their thoughts. A truth too big for explanation. A truth that would never fit inside sermons, or books, or doctrine. Because the truth was simple, terrifying, and beautiful. The sacred doesn't leave. It waits. In the weeks that followed, strange things continued to happen. During a midnight mass in another cathedral 3 countries away, every candle lit itself simultaneously when the priest whispered the words, "And let us remember those who are not with us." In a remote monastery, a monk painting an icon of the resurrection suddenly found his hand moving without conscious control, rendering the face of Bishop Adrian Keller, though the monk had never seen his likeness. And people began dreaming. Across continents, languages, and cultures, thousands reported the same vision, standing at the entrance to a vast, glowing chamber with 12 pillars and a mirror that doesn't show your face, but shows your soul. Some woke weeping. Others woke singing. But all woke changed. Because Bishop Keller hadn't left. The Mass hadn't ended. The veil hadn't closed. It had simply shifted, moved slightly to the side, just enough for those willing to see, to truly see, to understand a truth older than cathedrals, older than stone, older than language itself. The sacred never leaves. It only waits for us to remember how to listen. In the months that followed, the world around the cathedral remained outwardly the same. Streets bustled. Bells rang. Life moved as it always had. But for those who knew, something had fundamentally changed. The ground beneath that courtyard no longer felt like ordinary earth. It was as though it now held a pulse, a memory, a resonance, the unseen weight of something timeless pressing gently against the fabric of reality. Whispers began to spread beyond the city, beyond borders, beyond denominations. Monks spoke of hearing footsteps in empty cloisters. Nuns reported feeling a presence beside them in the chapel. Not cold, not haunting, but accompanying. Choir masters in distant countries noted that, for reasons no one could explain, their choirs had begun singing half a key higher, always during midnight mass. Not by choice, as if something was lifting them. But the most unsettling and most beautiful phenomenon was the return of the phrase. People began hearing it in the most impossible places. A woman sitting quietly by her father's hospital bed heard it whispered in his final breath. The Mass is not over. A boy playing alone near a mountain stream in Croatia told his mother. A man in white stood on the water and told me. I never left. None of these people had ever heard of Bishop Keller. None knew the story. And yet, the echo found them. The Vatican, now fully aware that this was beyond containment, stopped trying to suppress it. Quietly, they issued an internal directive among certain clergy. If you hear the voice, do not rebuke it. Do not fear it. Simply listen. A sentence that, to most outsiders, would sound like poetry. But to those who had touched the font, heard the pulse, seen the mirror, it was not poetic. It was instruction. And all across the world, a subtle transformation began. People lingered longer in silence. Masses ended with longer pauses. Confessions became quieter, but heavier, as though both priest and penitent understood that words were no longer enough. Something had been set in motion, not a disruption, but a continuation. A reminder that the sacred was not an event. It was a presence, and it had never left. By the 1-year mark, something extraordinary had taken root. The old cathedral, long marked by tragedy and mystery, was no longer just a place of pilgrimage. It became something else entirely, not a shrine to a vanished bishop, but a portal, not in the supernatural sense, not a crack in space and time, something subtler, something far more dangerous to the ordinary, a crack in the human assumption of separation. Visitors reported the same phenomena again and again. Not miracles of sight or sound, but miracles of knowing. A man who came burdened by grief, left not with answers, but with peace. A mother on the brink of despair stood before the olive tree and, without understanding why, began to sing the same hymn that had been sung during the midnight mass when the bishop disappeared, even though she had never heard it before in her life. The font beneath the earth, sealed once again after the chamber's closing, became more than symbol. It became memory, living memory, and everyone who approached it felt it, that the bishop's disappearance was not an ending. It was an opening, not an escape from the world, but a step deeper into it, into the layer of reality where the sacred is not something you visit, but something you recognize. The robe remains folded. The footprint remains preserved in the dust. And the pillars, 12 surrounding one that remains eternally empty, stand as quiet witnesses to something humanity has tried to forget for centuries, that the sacred doesn't come from above. It rises from within, and the Mass, truly, has never ended. Even now, those who walk past the cathedral after midnight swear they hear it. Not chanting, not singing, just a voice, gentle, patient, present. I never left. And beneath that, always the hum, the pulse, the breath of something waiting. And yet, the most extraordinary revelation wasn't what happened beneath the cathedral. It was what began to awaken within those who simply stood near it. The people who visited didn't always witness phenomena. They didn't always hear the voice. But something shifted regardless. Some described it as a weight lifting. Others said it was the opposite, a new gravity settling over their lives, pulling them deeper into a kind of presence they couldn't name but could no longer ignore. A young man, once an outspoken atheist, left the cathedral and later wrote in his journal, "I didn't find God. I didn't hear angels. But I understood, maybe for the first time, what it means to be fully here. Like something had been waiting for me to arrive my entire life. And I never noticed until now." This sentiment echoed in letters left at the base of the olive tree, tucked between the roots. Confessions not of sin, but of forgetfulness. Of forgetting how to be still, how to belong. Something else began to emerge in the background, something no one could quite explain. During midnight masses, not only at that cathedral, but in churches across continents, people reported clocks pausing, briefly, just for a second, a single tick refusing to move forward, as if time itself bowed its head in respect to something happening beyond its own measure. And then, when the hand resumed, the air felt different, thicker, holier. A group of scholars tried to document the phenomena scientifically. They measured electromagnetic fields, audio frequencies, gravitational anomalies, but found nothing. Nothing measurable, nothing repeatable. And yet, every single one of them left their instruments behind after the study ended. Not because the data failed them, but because they understood, finally, that the instruments were never designed to measure the sacred. They were designed to measure everything except what truly matters. Because the bishop had not disappeared from the world. He had disappeared into it, into the folds of every silence, every breath, every pause where the human soul remembers, even if only for a flicker, that the veil between heaven and earth isn't something that opens. It's something that has always been thin. We simply forget how to see through it. And so it continued, quietly, reverently, without headlines, without spectacle. The sacred does not need noise to announce itself. It only needs someone, anyone, willing to listen. The olive tree grew taller, roots deepening into the soil, as if anchoring the memory of what had unfolded beneath it. Pilgrims still came, but fewer sought miracles. They came instead for something far rarer in this world, stillness. They would sit for hours beneath that tree, not speaking, not asking, just waiting. And in that waiting, something always arrived. Not in form, not in sound, but in a shift, a breath behind the breath, a knowing beyond knowledge, a feeling that they were no longer standing before the mystery, but inside it, a mystery that didn't demand understanding, only presence. A child, no older than 7, sat cross-legged near the roots one morning. His mother found him hours later, staring quietly at the sky. When she asked what he was doing, he simply answered, listening. When she asked to what, he placed his hand over his chest and whispered, to the voice that doesn't use words. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The Vatican never reopened the chamber. They never needed to, because the truth had never been inside it. The truth had always been around it, within it, through it. The chamber was not the container of the sacred. It was the reminder that the sacred was never contained at all. It was always here, waiting in the space between heartbeats, between breaths, between the end of a sentence and the next word never spoken. And so the bishop's ring remains on display, not behind glass, but resting atop a simple slab of stone. No inscription, no plaque, only a single line, carved quietly into the edge, just small enough to be missed unless you were truly paying attention. It reads, "The Mass is not over." Over time, something remarkable became undeniable. People who had once come searching for explanations began to understand that this place, this story, was never about answers. It was about remembering. Remembering that the sacred was never locked behind rituals or walls, never hidden beneath robes or titles. It was always woven into the breath of the world, into the silent spaces most of us spend our entire lives trying to fill. Those who spend time near the olive tree often described a strange sensation, as though the longer they sat in silence, the thinner the air around them became. Not suffocating, not heavy, weightless, as if something was gently removing all the clutter they had carried in their minds, grief, worry, regret, until what remained was simply presence. Pure presence. No demands, no expectations, just the quiet awareness that something was with them. Stories began to circulate far beyond the city. A man in Argentina swore that while watching a midnight mass livestream from that cathedral, every candle on his home altar lit itself. A woman in a hospital bed in Tokyo whispered to her nurse in her final moments, "Tell them, the bishop, the Mass isn't over." No one knew what it meant. No one needed to. Those words carried a weight that bypassed understanding. They simply were. And as more and more stories emerged, a pattern became clear. This was not just a place anymore. It was a mirror that didn't show your reflection, but showed what was waiting beneath it, the part of you that always knew, even before you had words for it, that something sacred was holding you together. Something unshakable, something unbreakable, something that doesn't leave, ever. Because the bishop's disappearance was never an ending. It wasn't even a mystery to be solved. It was a crossing, a reminder, a whisper that became a wave. Proof not that the veil between worlds had been torn, but that maybe it was never there to begin with. And so, the world continues, busy, noisy, frantic. But tucked beneath that noise, beneath every hurried breath and every restless night, the hum remains. That low, steady pulse beneath the world's chaos. A reminder that the Mass is not over. That the sacred does not belong to temples or cathedrals alone. It belongs to kitchens, to bedrooms, to hospital rooms, to street corners, to wherever a human heart chooses to become still enough to hear it. Visitors still come, some expecting miracles, some expecting disappointment, but most leave with something they cannot explain. Something soft, gentle, a heaviness, but not the kind that weighs you down, the kind that roots you, anchors you, as though the ground beneath your feet suddenly remembers who you are, even when you forget. A young seminarian once asked an elder priest who had been there the day the ring was found, "Why him? Why Bishop Keller? Why did this happen to him?" The priest smiled, placing his hand over the young man's heart, and replied, "Because someone had to go first. Someone had to remind the rest of us how to come home." The robe remains folded. The footprint never fades. The pillars stand, 12 with one forever waiting, as if to say that the story is still unfolding, that the next step belongs not to the bishop, but to you, to anyone willing to step forward, to close their eyes, to breathe deeply, and to remember what was never truly forgotten. Because the truth is simple, terrifying, beautiful. The Mass is not over. It was never over, and it never will be. With every passing year, the boundaries between the ordinary and the sacred seemed to thin further. Not because anything changed in the world, but because people were beginning to notice. What once felt separate, the divine and the mundane, now shimmered together like two reflections on the same surface of water. The olive tree grew larger, stronger, as if feeding not only on earth and rain, but on the prayers, the silences, and the presence of those who gathered beneath it. Visitors often spoke of a strange phenomenon that defied language, the distinct feeling that they were not the ones arriving, but the ones being awaited, as though the space itself had always known them, recognized them, had been listening for their footsteps long before they ever decided to come. It was not haunting, it was homecoming, and once someone felt it, they could never unknow it. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when the bells, long cracked and forgotten, would emit a single, soft note, though no hands pulled the ropes. Witnesses described it not as sound, but as a vibration that settled directly into the chest, like the body itself was being rung. A reminder, a call, not to gather, but to remember that the sacred is not something that visits us. It's something that has always been waiting. In one such moment, an elderly woman collapsed to her knees beneath the olive tree, overcome not by illness, but by clarity. Between sobs, she whispered to no one and everyone, "I looked for him in the clouds. I looked for him in heaven. But he was always right here, beneath my feet, inside my breath, inside the silence I ignored for too long." And those standing nearby understood, because they had felt it too. The bishop had not disappeared. He had not left a void. He had become the space between the seen and the unseen, a bridge disguised as silence, a doorway mistaken for absence. His voice was no longer something to be heard with ears. It had become a pulse in the spine of the world, beating steady, beating gentle, whispering always, "The Mass is not over." And so it was that the story, if it could even be called that anymore, continued not as history, but as presence. The olive tree stands. The robe remains folded. The footprint, still crisp in the dust, remains untouched by time or wind. And the pillars, 12 steady witnesses, with one forever left empty, are not monuments. They are invitations. It is said that the empty pillar waits not for another bishop, not for a saint, not for someone extraordinary. It waits for anyone willing to remember, to listen, to stand still long enough to hear what is always speaking beneath the noise. The sacred is not reserved for the chosen. It is waiting in the cracks of the day, in the pause before breath, in the moment before sleep when the world is quiet enough to whisper back. A young child, no older than 6, once walked barefoot into the courtyard, knelt at the base of the empty pillar, and whispered as though speaking to an old friend, I know you're still here." And then she smiled, not because she heard a voice, but because she felt a reply. It wasn't a sound. It was a knowing, the kind of knowing that rewires everything you thought was true about distance, about separation, about what it means to be seen. For those who still ask what happened to Bishop Adrian Keller, the answer has never changed. It is written quietly into the roots of the olive tree, into the breath of every candle lit during midnight mass, into the spine of anyone who ever stepped close enough to feel it. He never left. Because the veil was never as thick as we thought. The sacred was never as far as we feared. The silence was never empty. It was always waiting, and it always will be, because the Mass is not over. The story no longer belonged to the walls of the cathedral, nor to the city, nor even to those who had first witnessed it. It had spread like something organic, not like wildfire, but like roots beneath the earth, weaving silently, connecting places, people, and hearts in ways no one could quite explain. There were those who had never heard of Bishop Adrian Keller, who had never set foot near the cathedral, and yet they felt it, in quiet moments, in sudden stillness, in the unexplainable urge to stop, breathe, and listen, not to the world around them, but to the presence that pulsed just beneath the surface of everything. It became impossible to ignore the patterns. Midnight masses across the world began to shift. Priests who had never been to that courtyard found themselves pausing longer after communion, as though waiting for something, or someone, they couldn't see but unmistakably felt. Congregations sat in shared silence longer than usual, not uncomfortable, not anxious, but held, as if by invisible hands. No one told them to. No one needed to. The pause had become the prayer. Even outside of churches, the echo continued. People spoke of strange moments, driving home late at night, staring at the sky, walking through empty streets, when the world seemed to fold into itself. Streetlights dimmed, wind stopped, and in that impossible stillness, a realization would wash over them like a tide. The Mass is not over. They didn't know where the thought came from. They didn't question it. They simply knew it, felt it, as if a truth buried deep within the bones of the world had risen, just for a moment, to remind them of something they had always known but had forgotten. There was no grand revival, no televised miracle, no viral video to prove it, because the sacred does not need an audience. It does not perform. It waits, quietly, patiently. It waits in the overlooked spaces, in the pause between footsteps, in the breath before a whisper, in the heartbeat between sorrow and hope. It waits not to be discovered, but to be remembered. It waits, as it always has, for someone brave enough to stop and say, "I hear you." And the olive tree stands witness. Its branches heavier now, its roots deeper, as if the tree itself carries the memory of everyone who has ever stood beneath it. The robe remains. The footprint remains. The pillars stand, 12 plus 1, still waiting. And beneath it all, the hum persists. The pulse. The breath of something not finished. Not forgotten. Not gone. Something that never left. Something that never will. The world keeps spinning. Wars rage. Markets rise and fall. People rush from one moment to the next, drowning in noise, in distraction, in the endless ache of forgetting. But not everyone forgets. Some, a growing, quiet few, carry the echo with them, not as a memory of something that happened, but as a presence of something that is. They move through the world differently now, softer, slower, anchored, as though they know a secret they do not own, but are responsible for remembering. It changes them in ways that are almost invisible. The way they pause before speaking, the way they look someone in the eyes a little longer, the way they choose silence over filling it with words that no longer feel necessary. It's not about religion. It's not about belief. It's about being, about remembering that the space between you and the sacred was never distance, only forgetting. For some, the realization comes in dreams. Dreams of an open courtyard beneath an ancient olive tree, of a folded robe that waits, patient and untouched by time, of 12 pillars and one space left empty, calling not to a chosen few, but to anyone willing to listen. And in that dream, or maybe in that memory, the voice returns. Not loud, not urgent, just steady, gentle. The Mass is not over. And when they wake, the world is both the same and forever changed. Traffic still hums. Deadlines still loom. But beneath it all, there's a new sound, a new weight, a pulse that was always there, but is now undeniable. And though they may not have the words to explain it, they no longer need them. Because some truths are not meant to be spoken. They are meant to be carried. So the question no longer remains, what happened to the bishop? The question has become, what happens to us now that we know? Because the truth is irreversible. The veil was never sealed. The distance was never real. And the sacred, it never left. It was always here, waiting, and it always will be. Because the Mass is not over. And as the years unfolded, it became undeniable that this was not a story to be finished, but a rhythm to be lived. People stopped visiting the cathedral in search of miracles. They came instead to sit in the presence of something that made them remember what the noise of the world had tried to erase. Not every visitor saw the robe. Not everyone felt the pulse beneath the stone. Some came and left in silence, thinking nothing had happened. But days later, weeks later, in the quiet of their own homes, in the stillness between sleep and waking, the realization would bloom like something planted deep. It never left me. There were those who arrived skeptics and left without answers. Not because answers didn't exist, but because they no longer needed them. They realized the sacred doesn't explain itself. It doesn't owe anyone proof. It simply is. Quiet, unyielding, patient. Its only request is that we slow down long enough to remember we are part of it, not apart from it. And once someone truly feels that, they are never the same again. An elderly priest, who had once served under Bishop Keller decades before his disappearance, returned in his final years to sit beneath the olive tree. He whispered softly, to no one and to everyone, it was never about finding him. It was about finding the part of us that he never let die. And as he closed his eyes for the last time, those who stood nearby swore they heard a bell. Not from the tower, long silent, but from the ground itself. A single, perfect note, a confirmation, a benediction. And so, the story breathed on, not in sermons, but in the space between them, not in answers, but in the questions that now no longer needed resolving. People began to speak differently about the sacred, less as something distant, far, untouchable, and more as something woven into the marrow of the world, into the cracks of every stone, into the pause between every heartbeat, a presence that had never once, not for a second, been absent. And the message, simple, steady, eternal, now passed from mouth to mouth, from soul to soul, from silence to silence. The Mass is not over. In the end, though this was no ending, it became clear that the story of Bishop Adrian Keller was never really about a man disappearing during midnight Mass. It was about something far older than that night, older than the cathedral, older than the rituals, older than the language we use to try and capture what cannot be captured. It was about what happens when the veil thins just enough for the world to remember itself. The robe still waits, folded with care, untouched by time, by dust, by decay. The footprint remains, pressed into the dust as sharp and fresh as the day it appeared, not as a relic, but as a reminder. The 12 pillars still stand, with one always left empty, not for someone special, but for anyone brave enough to stand there. Anyone willing to understand that the invitation was never exclusive. It was always for all of us. The olive tree continues to grow, its roots wrapped around the very bones of the earth, as if holding the memory of everyone who has ever stopped beneath its branches. Every tear, every breath, every whispered question, every silent answer. It has become more than a tree. It is a living witness to what happens when presence becomes more important than proof, when silence becomes more powerful than speech. And so, those who still come, and there will always be those who come, do not ask what happened to the bishop anymore. They ask a different question now. They ask it without words, and they receive the answer the same way. A knowing that fills the chest, a warmth that isn't heat, but recognition, a pulse that isn't sound, but remembrance. And it whispers, always, endlessly, lovingly, the only truth that was ever needed. The Mass is not over. With every generation, the echo grows softer in volume, but deeper in truth. Children who were born long after the bishop's disappearance arrive with no knowledge of the story. Yet when they step beneath the branches of the olive tree, something inside them stirs, something ancient, something familiar. They do not always have words for it, but their bodies understand. Their hearts remember. Some begin to cry without knowing why. Others simply sit and listen. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy left behind. Not a story to be retold, but a memory to be reawakened. A memory not stored in books or spoken in sermons, but embedded in the very marrow of existence. The presence that once spoke only through bells and scripture now speaks through wind, through silence, through the warmth of sunlight filtering through leaves, through the stillness that lingers after laughter fades. A traveler once arrived from across the world, a man who claimed not to believe in anything. He sat beneath the olive tree for hours without moving. When he finally stood, he placed his hand against the rough bark and whispered, "I was wrong. It was never that I didn't believe. It's that I had forgotten how to remember." And with that, he left, taking nothing with him but something unseen, something unshakable, something that would never leave him again. The robe, folded perfectly, remains untouched. The footprint in the dust does not fade. The pillars stand, silent, patient, eternal, bearing witness to the sacred weight of the unsaid. And the empty place among them waits, not as a void, not as absence, but as an invitation, an open door disguised as silence, a space held for anyone, for everyone, willing to cross the threshold where presence becomes more than a concept, where presence becomes a home. And beneath it all, beneath the roots, beneath the stone, beneath the skin of the earth itself, the hum continues, subtle, unyielding, waiting not to be discovered, but to be noticed, to be remembered, waiting for someone, anyone, to stand still long enough to hear what has never stopped speaking. The Mass is not over. And so it goes, not an ending, but a continuum, a thread woven into the very fabric of the world, invisible to the eyes, yet undeniable to the soul. Those who carry the echo do not wear special garments. They do not speak in riddles. They look like everyone else. A stranger on the subway, a mother folding laundry, a teacher pausing before speaking, a child staring too long into the horizon. But if you watch closely, you'll notice something different about them. The way they move, the way they pause, the way they hold silence as though it is not empty, but full. These are the ones who have remembered. The ones who have stepped into the presence that does not need to announce itself. They are the ones who know, beyond doubt, that the sacred is not a place you visit. It is the ground beneath your feet, the breath in your lungs, the space between each thought. The sacred is the pause itself. They do not preach. They do not convince. They simply live differently. And in their presence, others remember too. They remember that the distance between the divine and the human was never real, that the separation between heaven and earth was always paper thin, that the veil we speak of never closed. It never existed, not truly. And so, the robe waits, the footprint waits, the olive tree waits, the pillars, 12 and one forever empty, wait, but not as monuments to something lost. They wait as reminders of something that was never lost, something that has always been here, always watching, always listening, always whispering. The Mass is not over. It was never over. It never will be. And as the years continued folding into decades, something even more profound became clear. The cathedral, once defined by its walls and by what happened within them, had become something far larger, something borderless, shapeless, yet absolutely present. The sacred had spilled beyond the boundaries of architecture, beyond the olive tree, beyond the footprint, beyond the pillars. It had spread into the lives of those who carried the remembrance, into every corner of the world where someone paused long enough to listen, to breathe, to be fully present. In a quiet village oceans away, a woman who had never stepped foot on that courtyard knelt one evening beside her garden. She could not explain why tears filled her eyes so suddenly, or why her hands trembled as she touched the soil. But through her sobs, one phrase escaped her lips as though pulled from somewhere far older than her own memory. The Mass is not over. She had never read the story, had never heard of the bishop, and yet, somehow, she had always known. This presence was no longer something that belonged to a single event in time. It had become something stitched into the quiet fabric of the world, into kitchens, into hospital rooms, into long walks alone, into final breaths and newborn cries. It had become a pulse so steady, so patient, that most would miss it, unless they remembered what silence was made for. Not emptiness, not waiting, but meeting. The sacred, it turns out, had always been the meeting place between what we can see and what we never stopped feeling. And yet, through all of this, the olive tree stood, steady, silent, towering now above the courtyard as if it, too, understood its role, not as monument, but as vessel, a living witness that outlasts words, stories, explanations. Beneath its roots, the robe remained untouched, the footprint preserved as sharp as the day it was pressed into dust, and the pillars, 12 complete, one forever open, stood like breath held between heartbeats, not in waiting for something to happen, but as a reminder that it is always happening. And when people arrive now, drawn not by curiosity, but by something they cannot name, they do not ask why the bishop disappeared. They do not ask where he went. They arrive already knowing the answer. Because the moment they step foot into that courtyard, the truth rises in them like something they had always known, but never dared say aloud. He never left. Because the sacred never leaves. We are the ones who forget. It's in that forgetting, and the remembering that follows, that the heartbeat of this story truly lives. Because this was never about a miracle frozen in time, waiting to be studied, debated, or explained. It was about the most dangerous truth anyone can ever confront, that the sacred has always been here. Always. And that it has been quietly waiting for us to remember how to see it again. The hum beneath the courtyard continues. It's the same hum beneath hospital monitors in the stillness before a passing. The same hum beneath the cries of a child drawing her first breath. The same hum beneath a father's whisper as he forgives a son after years of silence. It is the rhythm beneath grief, beneath joy, beneath surrender, beneath every word not spoken but felt, because it never needed language to exist. It only ever needed presence. And so the pillars do not close the circle. They leave a space open, forever. Because the sacred has never been about completion. It has always been about invitation. The open space is not a void. It is a doorway, a threshold, a soft whisper in the bones of anyone brave enough to step forward and say, I am here. I remember. Not because the bishop is gone, not because he vanished, but because in his crossing, he showed the rest of us that the veil was never closed to begin with. The robe still waits. The footprint remains. The tree grows. The hum continues. But the question that once consumed everyone, what happened to him, has softened. It no longer matters in the way it once did. Because the answer was never about where he went. The answer was about what he became. About what we are always becoming when we choose to step out of the illusion of separation and into the presence that never left. And beneath it all, one truth remains. Simple, unchanging, carved not into stone, but into the breath of the world itself. The Mass is not over. It never was. It never will be. By now, those who arrive no longer search with the desperation that once filled the early years of this mystery. There is no expectation of spectacle, no longing for proof, no demand for explanation. They come differently now, not as seekers of answers, but as witnesses to presence. Their steps are slower, their voices quieter, their gaze softer, as if they are approaching something not outside themselves, but something deep within. A place in the soul that mirrors the courtyard, the olive tree, the robe, the footprint, the open space between the pillars that waits for no one, but welcomes everyone. And in that sacred stillness, a different kind of miracle happens. Not the kind that bends the laws of nature or suspends the rules of the world. No, the miracle is something far simpler, far greater. It is the miracle of remembrance, of the quiet realization that the distance between the divine and the human was always imagined, that the veil people spent centuries trying to pierce never truly existed. It was never a wall, only a forgetting. A young woman, sitting alone beneath the tree, once whispered into the wind, I thought I came here to find something. But it's clear now. I came here to return to something that never left me. And the branches above her swayed, not in wind, but in rhythm, as if the tree itself recognized her words, her knowing, her surrender, as if even the roots had learned to listen to the echoes of the sacred. And so, the space transforms from a site of mystery into a sanctuary of becoming. Not a place where people come to escape life, but where they come to return to it fully, to wake back up into the reality that the sacred is not hidden in special places or waiting behind supernatural events. It is folded into the fabric of every ordinary moment, into the warmth of another's hand, into the exhale of someone brave enough to pause, into the silence that lives beneath every sound. And still, the hum persists. Still, the olive tree stretches skyward. Still, the footprint remains. Still, the robe waits, not gathering dust, but gathering remembrance. And the 12 pillars stand firm around the one open space, that quiet, eternal reminder that the invitation has no expiration. The Mass was never something that ended. It was never something confined to an altar. It is the breath of the world itself. Today, when people speak of Bishop Adrian Keller, they no longer speak of a man who disappeared. They speak of a man who crossed, a man who remembered first, a man who surrendered fully to the truth that was waiting not beneath the church, but within it, not beneath the earth, but within the very heartbeat of life itself. And in doing so, he became more than a story, more than a legend, more than a mystery. He became a mirror that now stands silently before anyone willing to look deeply enough. A mirror that doesn't show a reflection of the face, but of the soul, of the sacred part that never broke, never left, never forgot, even when everything else did. And once you see it, once you truly see it, there is no going back to before, because the knowing cannot be undone. The remembrance cannot be silenced. The invitation cannot be unoffered. The most profound truth whispered through this story is not about what happened that night during midnight mass. It's about what is still happening, about what has always been happening, a current flowing beneath everything, beneath the noise, beneath the chaos, beneath the fear, beneath the forgetting, a pulse, a breath, a rhythm that patiently waits for us to fall back into step with it. And those who walk away from the olive tree, from the pillars, from the footprint, do not leave with souvenirs. They leave with something far more precious, a silence that speaks, a presence that does not fade, a knowing that cannot be erased. They walk away carrying the sacred not as something they visited, but as something they finally remembered had always been theirs. Because the truth is not buried in the courtyard. It is not locked beneath stone. It is not hidden in the folds of a vanished robe. It is here, now, in the breath, in the pause, in the waiting that is not waiting at all, but presence. And it sings softly, endlessly, eternally. The Mass is not over. It never was. It never will be. And as the decades melted quietly into centuries, the lines between what was legend and what was living presence dissolved completely. No longer did people need to ask, is it true? Because the truth had long stopped being something that needed to be proven. It had become something felt, something carried, something that wove itself into the fabric of every person who dared to stand still long enough to feel the pulse beneath the skin of the world. There were no longer pilgrimages in the traditional sense. People didn't come to the courtyard because they believed it was a sacred place. They came because they realized that the courtyard was simply a reflection of the sacred that lives in every place. The olive tree, the robe, the footprint, they were not relics. They were reminders. Gentle echoes left to help those still caught in the noise to remember what the silence had been whispering all along. A man nearing the end of his life once sat beneath the tree, his hands trembling not from age, but from awe. Tears traced lines through the dust on his face as he whispered, "I spent my whole life searching for God in the clouds. Only now do I realize He was in the pause between my own breaths." And as the wind wrapped itself softly around him, the leaves above answered, not with words, but with that low, steady hum that anyone who had stood here long enough knew by heart. The hum had never been a sound. It was a presence, a weight in the chest that felt less like burden and more like remembering you had something beautiful inside you all along. A pulse that synchronized with your own heartbeat until it became impossible to tell where yours ended and the sacred began. Because there was no boundary. There never had been. And beneath the tree, among the roots wrapped tightly around the bones of forgotten time, the robe still waited, not as proof of a man who vanished, but as an invitation from a man who remembered before the rest of us did. The footprint remained, not as a trace of where he went, but as a marker of where we are always invited to stand. And the 12 pillars, firm as ever, encircled the open space that was never meant to be filled by stone, but by presence, by remembrance, by anyone brave enough to step forward and whisper back, "I am here." And so it will continue, long after names are forgotten, long after books close and songs fade, long after the last storyteller speaks the final word. The truth will remain, not as something preserved in walls or held within traditions, but as a current flowing beneath everything that ever was and everything that ever will be. This was never a story about a man who disappeared. It was always about a world that forgot and then remembered, a world that lost its way in the noise and slowly, gently, found its way back to the hum beneath it all, the hum that says, without voice and without end, the sacred is not somewhere else. It is here. It has always been here. It has never left. The robe will fade. The footprint may one day be covered by dust. Even the olive tree may fall when its time is done. But the pulse, the hum, the presence, it will never fade. It cannot, because it was never something created. It was never something built. It was, and is, the very breath that holds the world together. And so, the pillars wait. The open space waits, not as absence, but as invitation, as the gentle breath of something that has always been speaking to you. Beneath every sorrow, beneath every joy, beneath every moment when the world grew too loud, and yet something inside you stayed quiet enough to listen. And that something, that pulse beneath the pulse, still whispers now. Whispering even as you sit here, reading, even as you breathe, even as you wonder whether this story was ever real. Because in the end, whether it happened or not, no longer matters. What matters is the presence it awakens inside you. What matters is that you remember what you've always known. That the veil was never real. That the sacred was never far. That the Mass is not over. It never was. It never will be. And now, as you sit here, breathing, listening, perhaps you understand what this story has been trying to show you all along. This was never about a man who vanished. It was never about a ring, a robe, or a footprint. It was about remembering what the noise of the world made us forget. That the sacred was never locked behind cathedral doors. It was never sealed beneath stone. It lives, right now, in the space between your own heartbeats, in the silence behind every breath, in the pause between one moment and the next. Look closely at your own life. How often have you rushed past the invisible? How many times have you mistaken the absence of noise for the absence of meaning? This story was never meant to fill you with answers. It was meant to leave something far more powerful lingering inside you. A question, not the kind that demands to be solved, but the kind that demands to be felt. A question that sounds less like, "Where did he go?" and more like, "When was the last time I truly listened?" Because the Real Crossing isn't beneath the cathedral. It isn't hidden under the olive tree. It's right here, in the quiet decision to remember what you've always known but maybe forgot. That the sacred is not something you visit. It's something you're a part of. It's the pulse beneath the noise, the whisper beneath the words, the presence beneath the world pretending to be ordinary. And if this story has stirred something in you, even the smallest flicker of recognition, then know this: the story isn't finished. Because it was never about what happened in that courtyard. It's about what happens now, in you, in the way you breathe differently after this, in the way you pause longer before speaking, in the way you notice the hum beneath the chaos of your own life and realize it's always been there. If this left a mark on you, if something in you feels just a little more awake, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, but remind. Leave a comment below and share what part of this story echoed deepest in you. Because your voice matters. Your presence matters. And if nothing else, remember this: the Mass is not over. It never was. And neither are you.